Hello everyone. So I don't feel like being on camera today, and also I am in like a really oddly neurodivergently wiggly mood. Somewhat impulsive, but also trying to actually avoid hyperfixation at the moment, but give myself something else to do that I care about. We'll see if this strategy works. But I figured I would kind of talk through a little bit of art process today. A couple weeks ago, after actually the last upload I did about making a tarot card on this channel, I started work on another one. This is my initial sketch for Arcanum number 5. And the reason I've turned on the camera today is because I might record a little bit of the undersketch process for it. I'm toying with the idea of showing my sort of sketchy bits and pieces a bit more on the channel, like a little bit more active art rather than just doing everything quote unquote behind the scenes. And I don't know, like it's fun to share, why not share it? Why not talk it through a bit? So before I do a little bit of the undersketch, I want to talk through my thought process for what the next stage is, because I could just proceed using my reference and work on the face, for example. But before I do that, I want to have a sense of what I'm doing color-wise with the drawing as a whole. So as I think you can see here, I'm going to move over, dropping things. So as I think you can see here, I have my undersketch. It is done in a light purple pencil. I do know that I want the overall color tones of this person's face to very likely have a bit of a cold or a bluish cast to it. And depending on the thing I'm about to discuss, I will determine what type of bluish cast that's going to be. My reference photo for this certainly has a bit of a bluish cast. It is a photograph taken out of doors. The clothing that my reference photo is wearing all has a very blue tinge to it. So I don't want to toy with that too much. I like the way it's balanced across the image. So as I said, this is my Arcanum number 4. I have already drawn Arcanum number 5. I have already drawn Arcanum number 4. That was the video that I did before. I will link it somewhere. And I also have already drawn Arcanum number 6, which I have not shown properly on this channel. Both 4 and 6 are wearing red clothes. The overall idea with this project that I'm doing, oh my god, there's like a green car outside and now everything's green. Great. Woo! It's actually kind of cool from like in the background there. Anyway, so the overall idea with this project, creative project that I'm working on, is that I want to have the focus on portraiture. I want this to be a thing whereby whoever interacts with the series, whether that's just me or anybody else in the future, whatever I end up deciding to do with this, I like the idea that everything brings you into the characters at play, that there is a very deliberate and very slow interfacing with these archetypes, these people, however you want to view that. So the emphasis has been on the details of the face, with an eye for some of the techniques, color choices, types of detail, types of positioning, and so on, of certain specific forms of historical portraiture. That, of course, lends itself really well to tarot, because so much of tarot is out of, especially by the time the early sort of incunabula come along in the 1450s to 1500s, you know, as the printing press takes off, a lot of what we get is coming out of the art intended for the book, the page of the book, or religious iconography and so on, such that the portraiture that we get in historical material is well suited to the card format, generally speaking. The iconographical symbolism is there. It's easily incorporated into an image, a card image. You know, if we think about, I don't know, what's a really good example? You know, Durer's illustrations of Samson or Melancholia. If we think about the portraiture of Jan van Eyck, like all of these things are roughly contemporary. Tarocchi, the birth of Tarocchi, roughly speaking contemporary. These are the traditions I'm borrowing out of, and this is what's affecting the distribution for me on the page, with a bit more of an emphasis towards the facial portraiture, the oil painting of the Northern Renaissance, specifically Flemish painters, and the emphasis that they bring to the sort of, like the twist that they bring to that sort of humanist flair of everyday detail. I myself am not necessarily a proponent of the humanist thing, except insofar as it really brings us into the details of something. Contrary to the Northern Renaissance, however, I am not paying a huge amount of attention to the details of the clothes. What I'm aiming for is focus on the face and emotional experience, and then by and large, the clothing that I'm including in this project is making historical reference with some aspects of, like say, a ruff or the way a collar is shaped and so on. But I also want it to be that the main focus is always going to be the face. So the clothing might, you could even say, is being reduced to like the impression of clothing, geometric shapes, or sort of like the silhouette on the level of detail that I'm hoping it's going to register in the mind. The quandary that that introduces with this is that sandwiched between two red cards, what I'm thinking I need at this stage in my development of this project, I've done a few of the other early major arcana, is that I may end up needing cooler colors. So I took a look at some of my, you know, more historical systems here. Certainly in the RWS, we have a red arcanum number 5, which in this system is the Hierophant. This is not really the direction I want to go so much. I'm not going straight up church figure. Obviously, some of the shapes and references are there with this. And certainly the emphasis on, I guess you could say, elder and an element of teaching and religiosity, the passing of traditions, the passing of wisdom that you get so often with Arcanum number 5 is intended to be in this sketch. So with that, combined with the fact that a lot of the, this isn't necessarily, I'm not necessarily always wanting it to be perfectly analogous to Arcanum number 5 specifically, but what I'm aiming for, here's Arcanum number 5. I definitely don't want to go this route either, the white with either blue or purple accent marks, because I think, once again, that's going to register too much as like Catholic, modern Catholic bishop, which is definitely a painting genre I've seen too much of and freaks me out. If I see another old man with a kissable ring on his finger, I'm going to puke. So that's not the route I'm going. If people see this in the end and want to go in a more overtly Christian hierarchy perspective with it, they can, but that is not necessarily what I want the immediate association to be. So we're not going this route, and we're not going this route. So color inspiration wise, one of the things you will see in a lot of historical portraiture, particularly of female figures, if what they are doing is referencing the role of, say, Mary in the church historically, is you're going to get various combinations of red and blue clothing. This is also true of the Christ child. Usually, in a lot of historical symbolism, the clothing colors of Mary will be the inverted version of the, or rather the opposite, versus inner versus outer as the Christ child. So blue being a color indicating the sacred nature of the wearer, and red indicating their humanity. So with Mary, you will often see the balance being diametrically opposed to the balance with the Christ child, whether the inner layer is blue or the outer layer is blue. Thus, what I'm kind of thinking of doing with this Hierophant, since what I need is a cooler color, is I was thinking either purple for a little bit more of a royal association, or blue. I don't think purple will make sense in this context, especially insofar as it follows directly after Arcanum number 4. I think some form of blue will make the most sense for Arcanum number 5, so that it can retain some of that aspect of the aged wisdom, the passing of tradition, and also the sort of sacred religious connotations that are often associated with Arcanum number 5, but it can also just take on a little bit more of a sage-like quality without over clinging to that idea. I want there to be a fairly open way to interpret this image, different angles to come at it, like from which to come at it. There is going to be an outer layer to the clothing, as you can kind of see here, draped around the shoulders, and a little bit of an inner layer. The inner layer I will determine once I have more of the color association, I think. I will likely take whatever other accents exist in the face color-wise and have some of them be brought out in the context below, just as his outer collar slash drapery meets. I will likely have a lot of those colors also form some of the undertones of this outer layer, but I think what I'm going to do is have this outer layer be blue, so that the way the color progression currently works in what I'm working on right now is Major Arcanum number 1 is a reddish purple. Number 2 is vested in largely white with bluish tones to the overall portrait. Number 3 has a very sort of iridescent green, light green, not very far, like a little bit more of an emerald color than this, but a green color. Number 4 is red. 5 will have blue tones. 6 has a darker, sort of more Caravaggio influenced kind of red going on with a single very strong light source. Yes. I think that's going to make sense, because at the moment things are skewing in a little too far of a specifically red direction. Even the warm tones in the deck are pretty much often showing up as red, and that's going to irritate me if I do that too much and too heavily distributed on one side of the major arcana versus another. So I think what I'm going to do with this is draw the face with the knowledge that this, especially the outer vestments here, are going to be blue. Hopefully everything I just said makes sense, and I'm going to move on now to just doing some sketches. I may or may not pause, I may or may not do speed recording or whatever that is, time-lapse stuff, or commentary. It's not clear to me yet. It depends on what I feel I end up having to say as I work on this. So we'll see how this goes. It's a learning process for me trying to record what the heck I'm doing when I'm doing things, because usually I'm in my little autistic nerd cave doing my autistic nerd cave things. So.
That's the ideal. Gentle hand of confusion. Lead me back to myself.
Okay, so what's going on now is I'm finding it very interesting to get my bearings on this particular reference photo's face. There are a lot of different qualities of shadow, informed not only by what's underneath, but also by the lighting around. As this is an older person's face, there are a lot more sort of geometric segments to consider as I'm beginning to give the various planes of the face context here. Now, obviously, like all of these little sort of mini, very, very light layers that I'm putting on are going to be drawn over and over and over and over and layered, and that those layers will eventually be what begins to blend to form the actual color tones that we would recognize in a face. However, I do find this early stage pretty crucial, not just for getting some of that context down to help me determine how the colors will build and so on and so forth, but it's a good stage for getting a sense of like, what is the character of the face after all? Obviously, the initial process for that is doing what you see here as a purple-toned sketch. But then, as you can kind of see with the colors I'm choosing here for this point in the game, I start to kind of look at, okay, what are the prevailing colors in these various different parts of the face? If I were to imagine, you know, if you think about a person who has not just a very like red or flushed skin tone versus a very cool skin tone or whatever, if you think about the sort of young person who flushes mainly in the cheeks, or if you think about someone in their in a different stage in life who, in general, they have what some people would call a very sun-kissed look, but it can acquire, when they're tired, a very sort of gray undertone about the eyes. You know, that kind of thing is part of what will start to communicate who you're dealing with, what you're looking at. It's not actually a matter of, you know, classically assumed skin tones and so on. It's, you know, what medical state is this person in? Further from that, you know, I think part of the experiment in doing these drawings is asking myself, asking any purely theoretical future viewer what their assumptions are about the, again, not the skin tones, but the sort of color tint or the shifting planes of the face. What do you do when you see a gray undertone? Do you assume things about a person? Does that say things to you about yourself? Like if you're interfacing with someone, you're absorbing the details of their face. I think for me, it feels really paradoxical in a way to be working on this project in the way I'm working on it, or indeed to have the artistic tastes I have in general. Because I find people's faces very intense. I do not ever choose. I never opt willingly into making eye contact in real life, for example. Yet I love a lot of very confronting, very challenging portraiture, artistically speaking. There's an artist called Monica Fernandez, who is from Mexico, who has just the most amazing portraiture, huge wall-sized portraits, oil paints, I believe, of little girls, giving the viewer the most confrontational, direct look. I do believe a lot of her art is not only about the innocence of childhood, but the intelligence of childhood. I think she does explore trauma, but she also explores childhood empowerment, the power of the imagination, the emotional and social perceptiveness of a child, the empathy of children, and so on. Her work, if you don't know it, is amazing, and she's gone through very distinctive, like, stylistic phases as over the course of her career as well. It's just really fascinating to look into. And those of you familiar with the Nicoletta Ceccoli tarot will likely recognize in her work, if you choose to check it out, that a very sort of similar look into my face and tell me that to my face kind of quality, except that so much of this kind of art features someone who is in total solitude, and I love that kind of paradox. You know, they look directly out at the viewer, but you, the viewer, when the drawing or the painting or the piece of art was made, you, the viewer, were not there. You're there now, though, and they evoke questions in you, and you evoke questions in them, and that all of that is done through the use of color, line, geometry, image composition. Of course, one can always say that some of this stuff is like, I don't want to say too subtle, because that makes it sound like I'm trying to say like, oh, it's too smart for someone else, and like definitely don't mean that. Layers are there for people who wish to see them, if that makes sense. Like, not everybody has to engage with a piece on exactly the same level as everybody else engages. And certainly art comes alive in the space between the maker and the viewer. It's a collaboration between the two. Art can be genius, but if it communicates nothing to anybody, then, you know, that's an interesting, like, you know, maybe the art then in that case exists purely for private reasons on the part of the artist, but these are the sorts of questions we ask ourselves, and that's certainly something I spend a lot of my time asking myself about, I mean. So to me, one of the forms that art is magic is that I can take colored pencils and just slowly layer and layer and layer and think about an actual human face, almost reduced down to shapes. We have, I don't know if you can see the way I have this angled right now, but we have a triangle shape here, which in the construction of a face might mean cheekbone. Just a simple triangle, right? Two triangles. This overall shape. This conical thing here, which is, in this case, the outline of his hair, may, to a viewer, evoke the headwear of the Pope, such as he appears in Tarocchi, and so on and so forth. Or it may not. A person may never come to that association. And on my part, it is only partially intentional. Blah, blah, blah. There are parts of it that are intentional, and then as I draw it, parts of it that I'm seeing come out as I think about the image, that I may or may not choose to accentuate further. It depends. And all of these things are part of how, at least I, interface with art. It's interesting also how artistic reference works, I think. And when I say works, I don't mean that's how it works, I'm right. I just mean like the lived mechanics of making references with art. Because of course you're presuming that a person viewing what you're putting on the page, as it were, is going to know what you were referring to, if you are making a direct reference. But sometimes those things are cultural. Many times those things are cultural. Certainly, I would say that on the part of the like of medieval art or Renaissance art or whatever, the point is that it's cultural ultimately. But at the same time, the Renaissance had a lot of very synthetic sort of like, okay, we're doing this now, among a relatively small number of artistic elites, commissioned by the rich. To the extent that we get to put these paintings in public places, then people will see them. Or, you know, these works of art, these sculptures, these commissions. So, you know, it begs questions of access, just like it does, like if you're interfacing with a given specific individual in an image, does that grant you access to this person? Are they granting you access? Perhaps it depends. If this is a tarot card, maybe it depends on what your reading question was, like the question you asked the cards to begin with. You know, the context in which you approach the imagery. The stuff that the artist puts in, to my mind, becomes part of a toolkit. They use a toolkit to make it, and then that toolkit goes on to be the viewer's toolkit. Much like magical correspondences, including, you know, whatever literal ones get put into artwork. So, Anyway, this is running the risk of getting muddy now because I'm talking, so I'm going to stop talking and go back to drawing without talking. Yeah. Okay, fronds and anemones. I have been drawing now today for, say, 3-ish hours, give or take, possibly slightly more. And I am pausing, drawing between the rainstorms, pausing during the rainstorms. I wanted to kind of take a quick clip with the handheld camera this time because the light's not great for me to see what I'm doing, but the camera seems to pick up some of the detail in the absence of the light. Would that it would do that with my actual face. But what you'll kind of see here are different stages across the face. My source image does actually have a difference in the quality of light between the two sides of the face. But it is not this marked, and I'm going to be doing certain personal interpretations with that information. So what you're seeing here is what will eventually start to register as a more sort of shaded green or blue toned side of the face with a little bit of a gray tinge to it. This side of the face will, in the end, I think anyway, have a little bit more of a warm tone, but I will want the entire face to have a bit of a grayed or a greened, cooled effect. But what I find so interesting about that process is the sheer amount of color that exists in what will ultimately be potentially quite a severe portrait. To my mind, this is part of what makes up the strength in historical portraiture of such an, intense light sources. So if we go back to that reference to Caravaggio, forgetting for a moment the absolute asshat that he was as a person, but if we go back to that concept of Caravaggio, to this idea of chiaroscuro and light sources, these purely golden forms of illumination that seem to burst from within the portrait. In a way, you could see that as it is bursting from within the portrait, depending on the techniques used. Oil painting is a layering process, especially for those sort of historical portraits. So there is an absolute kind of like, let's build up the layers and work the colors in, and using things like color theory to do that, so that the way we achieve a sort of the beginnings of an aged look here. You know, any number of interpretations we may take off of this to sort of mentally piece together a human face that makes sense to us, our brain doing that work for us, conceptually, cognitively, perceptually, and so on. If you actually zoom in, this is of course just a collection of strange yellows, some green tints, purple, and some very odd reds. Really. If I were to show you some of the pencils I've been using for this segment, I'll pick them up here. It's going to be quite hard to hold them, so I will make an attempt to place them on my easel instead, which I have propped on books because I am too tall for my table. But for the most part, actually, I have a few different other purple, sort of blue-purple tinges here. So for the most part, these here are, this being, by the way, the color primarily of my sketch. For the most part, these here are the colors that have gone into this face. Basically, very rainbow-like. If I rearrange the order here slightly, place the oranges over here, obviously. But anyway, the point is that to make up a human face, I'll just never cease to be fascinated by how color works. But I'm also deeply interested in the fact that I can't seem to perceive color personally in my own artistic practice. I can't seem to perceive color very well against a white piece of paper. I have only ever been able to care about the layering process, especially in things like colored pencil or pastel, against a black, opaque black surface. Now, some of this in oil painting would probably be answered by the fact that you sort of prime your canvas with a base color a lot of the time anyway. because that is going to, that does give you the information, the overall cast of your finished work, keeps it unified, makes it, by definition, kind of less translucent. So what I like playing with here is not just the color layering, but its opacity against a black surface. From a death positive perspective, I also find this very interesting. I've made the joke so many times about like, oh my god, it's like reverse decomposing a body. Composing, if you will, ha ha ha. But the point behind that I also like, that more seriously, that I find very interesting, is that this sort of thing, especially when you start with these sort of greener tinges, does actually look like the early stages of decomposition of a body, in particular because so often, at least in my drawing process, I'm leaving the eyes and the mouth for last, which of course are some of the first areas to go, along with a few other, in terms of like maggots and so on. So, you know, okay, not everybody takes it to this particular macabre place of like confronting the realities of death. I happen to find personal benefit and merit in that, but not everybody would. But certainly from a conceptual perspective about how we relate to portraiture, I think it's very, very interesting that, to my mind anyway, there is also always going to be the mortality, I suppose, of a character built into something. So even if you were then drawing, say, a completely mythical creature that was immortal, what you would be asking yourself in that process as you create them is, at what point do I depart from what we know artistically about how to portray anatomy of whatever creature, whether it's animal or human person or whatever? At what point do I depart in order to communicate the supernatural, the immortal, the everlasting? You know, these are the sorts of questions that, at least for me, are very, very long-winded to articulate in words, but the act of drawing accesses it in a second for me. I suppose this is incidentally also why art history exams always just felt like take your notes to class day, or whatever that used to be called. I personally always found it easier to remember concepts, dates in history, and so on through imagery rather than through, you know, note-taking and rote memorization. So yeah, I probably won't show the finished work in this video just because it is taking me a bit longer to draw it than I was originally anticipating, and I really would rather do this properly rather than even sort of like a slight pretense of rushing myself. I tend to be very unconsciously responsive to externalized standards that I place on my own self. So yeah, I am going to close this out here, and hopefully we'll have said something of value, or if not, like again, what, you know, as I kind of always indicate, just maybe this was in some measure an interesting experiment, but if not, feel free to disregard. I know I've said lots of things that are like sloppily worded, so yeah, hope everyone's doing well, taking care of themselves to the best of their ability, and being kind, and I will see you all next time.